Sometimes it feels as if one of the main prerequisites of any successful artist is to share their political views with us. It is no longer enough for us to enjoy art for what it tells us about the human condition or about transcendence and beauty. No, it has to be political and educative. Otherwise it is, apparently, meaningless. But since it is so hard to tie a Bach fugue to a current political statement, we have to make sure we give the artists ample room to share their political opinions. It's also a practical way of checking whether they're still in line. Now, Kremer criticizes the idea of artists taking a clear political stance, or at least it seems like it. He quite openly criticizes some colleagues for associating with politicians, even going as far as almost quoting Gergiev as an example of an artist who mingles with politicians and excuses this behavior by referring to the necessity of saving the orchestra. It's thus also no secret what kind of politicians Kremer wants to distance himself from. But just like with the question of truths or truisms, also here it's only halfway there if we shine a light on only one side. Yes, call me nitpicky, but if you only criticize artists that associate with the Russian or Chinese government, but don't mention the many instances of highly outspoken Western artists that mingle with our politicians on a regular basis and even actively participate in political propaganda, sometimes even far more directly than in Russia or China, then you are applying double standards. And in the case of such a political question, it is also a political statement in and of itself. If Gergiev's relation to Putin is worth hinting at in this book, and even becomes a talk show topic in an interview with Khatia Bunyatishvili, then one could at least expect a slight nod towards someone like, Yo-Yo Ma, just to name an example, and his participation in the glorious festivities surrounding the election of Obama, in which he performed the modestly titled piece Ode to Obama. In the CNN interviews surrounding this event, Yo-Yo Ma was spouting change propaganda in his typical endearing manner, which nevertheless was a case of an artist going all in on a political statement. Again, I'm not sure whether it's calculation or naivety, but if Kremer assumes that by only criticizing Russian artists and their connection to Putin he can remain politically neutral, he's gravely mistaken. And don't take it from me. Nowadays, it is very often the aggressive left wing of our society that claims that there are many instances where it is not possible to remain neutral. Either you're with us or you're with them. Which also means that by disavowing one side, you automatically align yourself with the other, unless you work really hard to make sure no one claims your allegiance. Even if I might sound like a broken record, I do have to stress that I firmly believe Kremer has to know this, and I find it hard to believe that somebody as obviously intelligent as him can't see this. Either that, or he really believes in this lopsided worldview and can't see how artists are politicized in the Western world. In that case, he is far less perceptive and smart than I would have thought. Frankly, we shouldn't underestimate the effect his political stance, or his perceived lack thereof, has on his career. The last years have shown quite clearly how people's careers can be ruined if they don't follow the rules, whether that is in China, Russia, the US or Europe. Kremer is playing his role quite well, to an extent even that I would dare to call him a gatekeeper. This would also fit quite well with the overall impression of this book. It complains about the evils of a capitalist music industry, something that is quite fashionable these days, without giving us real answers or insights into the problems, and the only people left untouched are those that follow a set of dogmas and rules. Last but not least, let me wrap this section up with a small anecdote. Some years ago, I heard from a rather left-leaning music agent, surprise, that he has a problem with some Russian artists because, according to his opinion, they didn't distance themselves enough from Putin, the Russian government and Russian politics in general. It became quite clear that this would form an important part of whether he could or would promote these musicians. I should add that while he might not have been working for the biggest music agency worldwide, he wasn't necessarily a small fish either. And by putting this out, he made it quite clear that taking a very specific political stance was a prerequisite for having a shot at a career in the European market. Once more, it wasn't enough to remain neutral. No, they were expected to disavow very specific points, thus aligning themselves with a different set of politics. Considering all this, it becomes increasingly hard to believe that Kremer's omission of examples from the Western world is mere coincidence. It's either that he knows full well what he's doing, or he's so brainwashed that he doesn't even notice anymore. That's all the options there are. Given how much time Kremer spends evoking the spirits of the greats of the past, it is fascinating how little historical perspective he has. Or maybe he knows and omits it, as it doesn't help his point about politics and the art. As explained above, not only is his own stance not politically neutral, artists throughout history haven't been politically neutral at all, and not even on the right side of history, as that is probably closer to what he expects them to be. For centuries, almost all of the great composers have been offering their services to the ruling classes of their times, and rarely have they decided to bite the hand that feeds them. He who pays the piper calls the tune. Even someone as unruly as Beethoven did, after all, dedicate his works on a regular basis to some of his patrons, such as Lichnowsky. Just as well as Rembrandt or Vermeer wouldn't refuse painting a certain merchant because he was not invested in fair trade, nor as one of the many Italian artists that depicted corrupt cardinals and popes. This sort of moral grandstanding is a distinctively modern phenomenon that could only appear once the patron became the faceless entity known as the state. Suddenly, it is not anymore the individual interest in the arts or in the representative quality of art by a patron that makes it possible for artists to make a living, but the political agenda of a state, often determined by either committees or, even worse, completely non-artistic political factors that become responsible for funding those artistic endeavors. Just as musicians of the past would have been loyal to kings, lords, and churches who funded them, musicians of the second half of the 20th century would become fanatically loyal to the social welfare state that funded them, which is the reason why so many musicians and artists in general these days are rather openly left-leaning, as it is a left-leaning state that still keeps handing out arts funding. The main difference here is that while kings of the past, Louis XIV comes to mind as a popular example, would certainly pursue political purposes with the way they employed art, the main goal of the artwork itself was to impress, be beautiful and transcending. And the main duty of the artist was to create the artwork. The modern state, however, has almost completely eliminated the need for beauty and transcendence in the art, as not only is it difficult to decide on by committee, but with the progressing secularization of all arts, the transcendent aspect that ultimately drove the concept of beauty expressed through craftsmanship disappeared in favor of the infamous message that's being transported through art. Diving deeper into this matter would be a topic for another video by itself, but in the meanwhile I can only recommend to look into Sir Roger Scruton's writings on that matter, or the documentary he made years ago, Why Beauty Matters, which can actually be found on YouTube. What is, however, possible, and in fact the specialty of the modern state, is to set up a set of rules and regulations, of political agendas and goals that demand the art to transport a certain set of ideals outlined in advance to further a certain political perspective. In that sense, the loyalty and function of the modern artist isn't that dissimilar to the artist of old, only that it is now his own personality or the meaning he needs to attribute to his artworks that transports the desired message, rather than the quality of the artwork itself. The irony behind all this is that the social state has been reducing the funding of the arts for decades now, but despite their proverbial creativity, artists seem to be rather unwilling to consider other options to fund their crafts. Crowdfunding is, for instance, one first step in the right direction. One of the reasons for that is the idea that selling your art is seen as an almost dirty word, which is ironic because it's based on the wrong assumption that if you're adapting your projects to fulfill the various written and unwritten rules that safeguard the access to grant money, like, let's say, disavowing certain politics, you wouldn't be actually selling your art. Also, the fact that art is an inherent part of the social state leads in consequence to not only a stifling process of private funding of the arts, but also leads to the arts turning ever more political, as the social state has turned inevitably into an educative bureaucracy, in which the value of something isn't judged anymore by its intrinsic value, but by the educative or political quality attached to it. This might also explain why some painters get away with selling empty canvases with 4 pages of explanation attached to it. The story behind the art is more important than the art itself. If you like your artists to be heroes in all walks of life, it might disappoint you to think of artists as ultimately rather opportunistic when it comes to politics. Artists tend to not bite the hand that feeds them, and frankly, I don't blame them for it. It is not their task either, no matter how deep their understanding of the human soul might be. Just as I don't expect a football player to criticize the sheikh or oligarch that pays for his horrendous salary, I don't expect the artist to criticize the patron that pays his bills. What does annoy me, however, is the lack of honesty in these matters, the smugness that goes along with the feeling of being a supposedly free soul that just speaks its mind. It is either completely dishonest or blinding self-deception. Whatever it is, I wish they'd stop it and focus on their art instead. When Gidon Kremer talks about the vanity of the music industry, the fast-playing virtuosos, the sexy starlets, the willingness to sell oneself, then he is describing a very real aspect of the music industry. Vanity and glamour have always been a factor in the entertainment industry, and over the past 60 years or so, this has gradually evolved, or devolved, however you want to call it, to a point where it's become less and less subtle. Competition is high, and nowadays also young classical stars need to be attractive and physically marketable. In Kremer's youth, the preferred image of a classical artist was still somewhat different and less obviously affected by the influence of the predominant pop culture, especially in the Soviet Union where he grew up. Back in the 60s and 70s, when Kremer's career launched, being a slightly grumpy intellectual with wild hair was a perfectly marketable image as well, maybe even on par with your average pretty boy or pretty girl. This has changed quite drastically. While the industry still keeps a few eccentrics around, it has become increasingly harder to break through without a marketable image. Kremer, in my humble opinion, lacks a certain understanding of the industry if he assumes that his image wasn't marketable and thus wasn't being sold. In fact, it could be argued that his career profited greatly from the image he built up over the decades, and it is nowhere proven that he could have sustained this level of prominence without the surrounding image. But I'll admit that this is speculative and hard to prove one way or another. What remains clear for me, however, is the fact that his image didn't place him outside of the industry, but that it just covered a different set of bases. Multinational companies have long figured out that rather than trying to feed a single product to the whole market, they can cover larger target audiences by providing the market with often contrasting products. The same people that sold Britney Spears sold also Marilyn Manson, and the same people that sell Gidon Kremer also sell the next young and sexy virtuosos that Kremer warns us against. As such, Kremer is just living on the flip side of the coin, and so his advice ultimately isn't as revolutionary as forge a new coin, but rather, don't be on that side of the coin, be on mine. Mine's more respectable. And that is too little an insight for my taste. There's actually also another coin, if you will, which is somewhat tied to the first one. Because so far we've been talking about what I'd call the selling industry, the industry in which artists are being sold by CD labels, concert halls, tour managers, promoters, etc. The thing that is being sold is an image, which can be a variety of things as we've discussed. But there's also another industry, namely what might be best described as the political industry. Not that Image isn't important to make it there as well, but this Premier League of the arts is reserved for those artists that are willing and able to take a stance of sorts while maintaining a certain minimum level of relevance. And don't be fooled, it's not about just any stance, it's gotta be the right stance if you want to remain relevant. It is these kind of artists that can expect at first to get institutionalized and to later on receive ample funding, grants, state honors, etc. These artists also tend to show up on regular occasions on TV or at openings of festivals or other important ceremonies where they usually remind us that while we're here to celebrate the arts, we should really be talking about political issue XYZ right now. Which is in turn commonly welcomed by thunderous applause from a public that consists of press, agents, politicians and other artists that are hoping to achieve a comparable status at some point in their careers. At this point, being an artist has nothing to do with the art anymore. But it is about power, as Rolf Peter Siefele pointed out quite correctly in his Finis Germania. The artist turns into a person more defined by their personal charisma rather than by their actual artistic output. These artists tend to act as a moral compass for society, as if the ability to portray another person on screen or playing a violin concerto is in any way indicative of political insight. And artistic merit or fame isn't what counts anyway, since regularly we hear social commentary from poets no one ever read a line from, so it isn't necessarily their artistic success that qualifies them, but their willingness to act as a bullhorn for political activism. Kremer most certainly belongs to this caste as well, and nowhere does this become clearer than in his dishonest call for supposed political neutrality, which is actually a call to artists to align themselves with the liberal politics dominating the Western world. This is why he's a gatekeeper. This is why he's in the upper echelons of the political industry. And this is why, despite his supposedly uncomfortable nature, he's so revered by the press and all major institutions. Self-hatred sells, especially nowadays, and Kremer has cultivated a public persona that allows him to perform this role perfectly. His image within the selling industry plays right into this as well, and even if it might not have been a conscious choice for him, the way his career has shaped up over the decades paved the way right to this point. On a side note, it might be interesting to look at some younger musicians and how they are faring within this coin. If we take, for example, Khatia Bunyatishvili, the supposed young pianist to which Kremer wrote those letters, then we see that she quite clearly is willing to use her physical attributes when it comes to promoting herself. At the same time, she is setting herself up for the future by stressing, similar to Kremer himself, by the way, her intellectual background. And it's a smart move. Once she gets older and her looks will be surpassed by the next young girl, she'll have to find another niche for herself. You don't become the grande dame of the piano world overnight, so she's obviously planning ahead for that as well. Most importantly, however, she wants to end up in the political industry as well, as do most artists, because it's a lot less work to hold a half-assed speech against Putin and nationalism than it is to memorize a new piano concerto. And so if you read or hear an interview with her, it doesn't take long for her to become political. Yes, she isn't at the stage yet that she can lecture complete halls on live TV on humanity, but she is putting in the hours to signal that she is most willing and capable to fill that role at some point. It is pretty much a classic example of so-called virtue signaling, and artists are usually very aggressive about it. As such, I'd like to encourage you to read through any interview with an up-and-coming music star and see how long it takes them to more or less aggressively virtue signal some political views. And always bear in mind their backgrounds. Who is the hand that feeds them now? Who are they trying to appeal to in the future? It all becomes pretty obvious after some time, and once you notice it, you can't unsee it anymore. So, would I recommend this book? Well, I would. If only because there isn't much out there by other famous artists that goes in a similar direction. So for that alone, it might be a good entrance into the topic, especially if you're new to it. You can of course always read a book like Another course, Musik als Klangrede, which is just on another level compared to this, but also has some critical components of the music industry in it. Still, that book isn't really about the music industry in general, and what's in there partially describes an industry from 40 to 50 years ago. Other works on this matter aren't really all that perfect either. Let's not start about Who Killed Classical Music by Norman Lebrecht. And the fact that Kremer's criticism can't just be chalked up to bitterness or jealousy makes it a worthy attempt. If you really want to look further, you'd actually have to look more into literature that treats the matter on a more societal, political or philosophical level, which hopefully we'll be able to talk about in other videos in the future. Even if Kremer acts as a gatekeeper, if you read through it with a critical mind, you might be able to learn how to decipher coded language of artists much better. So with all that said, I'd still recommend this book for anybody interested in the topic, if only to look at it critically afterwards, which, as I realized myself in this video, can be even more fun than the book itself. And that's it for today. Thanks so much for watching. Fun fact, this shorter version of my script has now actually exceeded the length of my first script. Guess I have no other choice than going through that translation work after all. In any case, let's not add more text to it, so please don't forget to like and subscribe. Hit the bell button for notifications that won't appear anyway, and please leave a comment. Have you read Kremer's book? And if so, what did you think of it? Do you find his criticism legitimate, or do you also feel that there's a lot left to be desired? What's your favorite physical attribute of Khatia Bunyatishvili, and what do you think about my theories of the selling and political industries? I'd love to hear your feedback and hope to see you soon in my next video.